It's been about 3 years running now that Dean Kremer has looked like a pretty good number 5 starter for the Orioles. But is that kind of just his role now moving forward? We'll try to answer that question coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Thursday, December 5th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to continue our player season review series and take a look at Dean Kremer's 2024 season. He was good in some ways, was a solid guy at the back end of the rotation. He struggled in others as the walks started to get to him a little bit, and he might have kind of siloed himself into one role for the Orioles. Tell you what went right, what went wrong, and the biggest outlook for Dean Kremer heading into next year. That's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So let's talk about Dean Kremer. We continue on with our 2024 Orioles player season review series. Go through each player, pretty much each player on the 40-man roster. We're getting down towards the second half of things here. Talk about what went right for that player, what went wrong for that player, and then their biggest storyline heading into the offseason and into 2025. And today we talk about Dean Kremer, who gave the Orioles 24 starts this season. He first came up to the big leagues in 2020, was kind of up and down in 2021, but then established himself in 2022 and has been a part of the Oriole rotation since then. But in 24 starts this year, 129 and 2/3 innings for Dean Kremer. He posted a 4.10 ERA with a 4.32 FIP. That was worth 1.4 wins above replacement, according to FanGraphs. He had a 41.7% ground ball rate, which was a career high, to go along with, on the season, a 22.2% strikeout rate and a 9.2% walk rate for Dean. And let's start with what went right for Dean Kremer this season. That was, well, he kind of stopped getting hit so hard. And that was one of the things that had really hurt him in years past. Now, his 4.10 ERA this year, pretty even to his 4.12 ERA in 2023. When you look at the FIP, that's fielding independent pitching, his FIP this year was a solid chunk lower than it was last year. And that's usually because he's not getting hit as hard. FIP tells you maybe what your ERA maybe should have been closer based on your quality of contact and adjusted to the ballpark and the defense behind you and all that good stuff. He had been in the bottom half or really even bottom third of pitchers in baseball in terms of hard hit rate allowed and average exit velocity allowed throughout his career. I mean, he was really bad in 2021 in those 13 starts, but no pitcher got hit harder on average than Dean Kremer in the majors in 2021. So it's been a long ride here for Dean, but 87.4 mile per hour average exit velocity was in the 84th percentile this year. Like, where'd that come from? 35.4% hard hit rate in the 76th percentile in Major League Baseball this year. Where did that come from? He dropped his hard hit rate 5% from last year. Only 16 pitchers in the majors also had a larger drop in average exit velocity allowed than Dean Kremer did in that 2023 to 2024 timeline. Like, no, not many pitchers improved their ability to avoid hard contact more so than Dean Kremer did this year. And again, I mentioned the 41.7% ground ball rate, a career high. So when you're giving up less hard contact and you're giving up more more contact on the ground, you're just not getting crushed as much. And that is a lot of numbers to say he wasn't getting crushed as much at times this year. And that helps you be a better pitcher and keep your teams in games. He also had a lower home run to fly ball rate, which certainly helps in terms of getting crushed and giving up the big swing. Like, it was a lot of good stuff in that category for Dean Kremer. And some of that this year was adding the splitter. He used to throw more of a classic changeup, but he turned it into a splitter this year. And his usage was up. He used to throw the changeup about 12% of the time. This year, he threw the splitter 19% of the time because it was just a better pitch than his old changeup was, and it performed much better. This year, opponents hit 139 with a 248 slugging and a 36% swing and miss rate against Dean Kremer's splitter. It was basically his number 3 most used pitch, still threw the four-seamer and the cutter more often, but then it went splitter, sinker, and curveball for his 5-pitch mix. And the splitter, I mean, you look at it, it graded out as his best pitch this year. Like, he didn't have an elite pitch, didn't have a lot of way above average pitches. But if you listen to, Eno Saris of The Athletic talk on rates and barrels, like, he likes Dean Kremer a lot, not because Dean Kremer has elite pitches, but he's like, hey, Dean Kremer has 5 legitimate big league pitches. Now, none of them are elite, but not a lot of guys can say they have 5 pitches that they feel comfortable throwing at the big league level to help get guys out. And that's what you see from Kremer, because it is 5 pitches, but he throws that curveball, 11.4% of the time. And that's his least used pitch. So if you're throwing every pitch between, 11% of the curveball and 32% of the fastball, like, you're throwing every pitch more than 10 or 11%, that's telling you are trusting all 5 of your offerings right there. And not a lot of pitchers in Major League Baseball can say that. And then you look at the splitter and how good it was. I mean, that whiff rate pretty much equal to the Kevin Gausman and Nathan Eovaldi elite splitters. That's where Kremer had that pitch. Now, he still doesn't have consistent command of that splitter, and that's why he didn't throw it even more, and it wasn't still better than it certainly could have been, but it's there stuff-wise. And he did start to command it better in the second half. And in the second half of the season, it upped his cutter. That splitter became his number 2 most used pitch in the second half. He was up to 22% usage down the stretch. And what that led to was a really strong finish to the season for Kremer. That first half was him kind of feeling out the splitter, in and out of how much he wanted to use it. Then the second half, he found it, knew it was his out pitch, and he went to town. He had a 3.82 ERA after the All-Star break. He had a 2.25 ERA in September in his 4 starts there. He really, really finished strong for the Orioles, which they really needed as they were reeling in the month of September. I mean, 24 innings in September, 24 strikeouts to 7 walks. He had a 48% ground ball rate, 27% hard hit rate. Those 4 starts in September included 2 of his 6 best starts of the season by game score. Like, he was really good down the stretch for the O's. The four-seamer, the splitter, the cutter all had batting averages under 200 against him, all had whiff rates over 35%. Command was better. Stuff plus was better. And he was in line, I think, to start game 3 of that wild card series. They went Corbin Burns game 1 and Zach Eflin game 2. And if the Orioles had found a way to score any runs and win one of those 2 games, I think it would have been Dean Kremer getting the ball in game 3, winner take all, against the Royals in that wild card series. And that was because of how well he had pitched in September. You were a little worried about it, right? Because he got clobbered in game 3, the ALDS, when the Orioles were eliminated by the Rangers in 2023 in his first career playoff start. That made you a little queasy about it, but he then had the experience, and he was so good in September that you were like, yeah, you looked around and you said, Grayson Rodriguez is hurt. Dean Kremer's the Orioles' 3rd best starter right now. Like, yeah, he's our game 3 starter. And I would have felt okay with it going out there in game 3. So there were definitely some things that Dean Kremer showed us this year that he can take into future years and say, hey, I've got something to lean on. I've got this splitter, another offseason of developing that splitter, and he could be even better. But it wasn't all amazing things for Kremer in 2024. He dealt with an injury. He had some things go in a negative direction as well. We'll talk about what they were coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So for Dean Kremer, there were certainly some things where he took a step in the right direction in 2024, but there were others where he did not. Let's go to what went wrong for Dean Kremer in 2024. And the first thing was, after a healthy 2023 season in which he gave the Orioles 32 starts, 172 and 2/3 innings, He missed some time with injury again this year. He was out from May 24th to July 3rd with a right tricep strain. Now, it wasn't the worst timing for the Orioles rotation because Cole Irvin at the time was pitching well. They had recently gotten John Means and Kyle Bradish back. But then those guys got hurt again, and Cole Irvin started to struggle. And eventually in late June, the Orioles had to call up Cade Povich to join the rotation because they didn't have Kremer, and other guys were struggling, and he missed some time to cement himself even further in that rotation. The other thing was he wasn't as close to the command artist that you could argue he was his last two seasons. Like 2022, he had a 6.6% walk rate. 2023, 7.5%. That's not necessarily command artist, but those are good numbers. This year it jumped to 9.2%. Now it's still not terrible. It's still certainly workable. It's still higher than average, but you can have a 9% walk rate and be a good starting pitcher. But it was his highest since 2021. And some of that was because he was throwing way more splitters. It was a new pitch, and early in the year, he struggled a little bit more to command it. But some of that was just that his other pitches, kind of his go-tos, his four-seamer, his sinker, his cutter, which he could always rely on to throw for a strike, he couldn't do as much of that at times in 2024. And it was certainly noticeable for Dean Kremer. And a good chunk of it was the four-seam fastball kind of betrayed him. Now, it was still his number one most used pitch, 32%, but the usage was down. It was 37% in 2023, so he threw less of them. And also, the stats against it were fairly similar last year to this year, but the velocity went down. Like, he averaged 94.6 on the fastball last year. He was down to 93.4 on his average velo, like down by more than a mile per hour year to year for a guy who's 28 years old. That's a little bit concerning. Yeah, it's only one. It's not two or three. You're not looking directly at injury. And of course, he did have the tricep issue this year. So it was a little bit of that contributing to a little bit of velocity dip. But that's something that can concern you. And if you look at how the fastball played, like his velocity basically went back to what it was in 2022. So that's the other part that's a little better. It's like, okay, earlier in his career, he was throwing this velocity. He kind of upped his velocity last year. So you do wonder, like, what changed? Was there different workout regimens or routines in the offseason? But his four-seamer via StatCast had a plus 12 run value in 2023. That's great. That's a really, really good four-seam fastball. It had a straight up 0. It was rated as an average four-seamer instead of being a plus this year. And that changes a lot because, again, even when you drop the usage, when you lose some stuff on your four-seamer, your number one pitch, you're just not going to be as good of a pitcher. And he was still able, again, to use his other pitches, get the splitter, and still have a basically an identical ERA this year to what he had last year. But the lack of the four-seamer makes it worse to try and project what Dean Kremer could be. That's what you're more worried about. Like, hey, he found a way with a lesser four-seamer to still get outs and be solid in 2024. But if he can't get back to the four-seamer we saw in 2023, what does that mean for next year and the year after and the year after? That is really the questions you have to answer. Like, it had less swing and miss. It got slugged at 100 points higher. And sometimes just a 1 mile per hour difference on that four-seamer can make a world of difference in how effective that pitch can be. Because when everybody's throwing in the 90s, those 1 mile per hour differences are huge. They're bigger than you expect. And especially for a certain pitcher, if he's used to 94, 95, and now he's 93, like that is a big difference for a guy in there. And again, even with the lower hard hit rates and even with the new splitter that was really good, you look at Dean Kremer's whole body this year. And I mentioned, right, 4.12 to 4.10 ERA in less innings because he had that tricep issue that kept him out for 5 or 6 weeks early in the season. Even though he had those good things I talked about, I don't really feel like Dean Kremer took a step forward in 2024. Now, you can let me know if you think I'm wrong. Like, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Put it in the comment section here. Like, if you think Kremer did, as a whole package, take a step forward as a pitcher. Like, I do want to know, put it in the comments. But I just think when you look at his entire season versus last year, it's like, okay, he was still helpful. He was still an important part of this Orioles rotation this year. But I don't know if I would say, like, yeah, he took a step forward. Like, he is a better pitcher than I thought he was December of 2023. I don't think that's the case. I don't think he's a worse pitcher. That's always good. You don't want to be regressing at age 28, but I'm not sure he took a step forward that we would have liked to see out of Dean Kremer. Like, you look through the stuff and, the cutter played a little worse. The four-seamer played a little worse. Obviously, the splitter was a huge addition. That the sinker was clearly worse. Like that was a pitch that kind of just evaded him at times this year, command wise. He dropped the sweeper and he only threw that like 3% of the time last year, but he was kind of toying with it coming out of the World Baseball Classic, and he dropped that completely this year. Does he go back to that? Does he add a more traditional slider back to repertoire? He's already got 5 pitches. Does he need a 6th one? I'm not really sure. It's all kind of like, you're not quite there yet with Dean Kremer. And that's really the big picture takeaway on Kremer, right? And that's what I want to get to up next to kind of finish off the show. Like who is Dean Kremer to this Orioles team? You can't, like, he is an important part of this Orioles rotation, but who is he really? As he starts getting a little bit closer to free agency and the Orioles starting to think about his future, like what is Dean Kremer to the O's? We'll try to answer that to finish off the pod coming up next. So we talked about what went right this year for Dean Kremer. We talked about what went wrong. Now the final segment is basically the biggest storylines heading into the offseason and into 2025 for 28-year-old Dean Kremer. Now he'll be 29 in about a month. So next year will be his age 29 season. And he's hitting arbitration for the first time. His MLB Trade Rumors projection is for him to make $3.5 million next year. The Orioles have already tendered him a contract. That means they're going to come to an agreement with him. He'll make somewhere between $3 and $4 million next year. Yes, he's getting more expensive because he got paid about $800,000 this year, the league minimum. So he certainly gets more expensive, but he's an important part of your team. You got David Rubenstein here. That's not a big issue right now for Dean Kremer. And he's also, he's not a free agent until after 2027. The Orioles still have 3 more years of team control, 25, 26, and 27 for Dean Kremer. He also still has 1 more minor league option year next year. So if things were to go south, they could actually send him to Norfolk without penalty still next year, which is a nice piece of roster flexibility to have. But you kind of look at Kremer and you're just like what is really the role for him? Like, I think the big question for Kremer is if the Orioles really do go spend and add to this rotation, like we've heard about, like David Rubenstein and Mike Elias have talked about, like has been reported about, can Kremer keep his spot? Because on the current team, I would argue there's only 2 starters who it's like, no matter what you do, they will have a rotation spot next year. And those guys are Grayson Rodriguez and Zach Eflin. I truly believe that anybody else on this Orioles team right now could lose their rotation spot if the Orioles go out and upgrade. And that includes Dean Kremer. Now, if the season was starting tomorrow and the Orioles had to put together a starting rotation, like obviously Kremer is in it because they need to do some upgrading in this rotation. If you were to look at the Orioles rotation right now, it would probably go Grayson Rodriguez, Zach Eflin, Dean Kremer, Albert Suarez, and Cade Povich. And as much as all of those guys gave to the Orioles in 2024, you need to upgrade to have a better rotation than that. The Orioles will. I mean, I'm willing to bet substantial amounts of money that the Orioles add at least 1 starting pitcher that slots into that rotation this offseason. I'm hoping they add 2, but it's almost guaranteed they're going to add at least 1. So my thought would be, okay, either Povich or Suarez gets pushed out first. I would argue probably Povich. I'd give Suarez a slight edge over him at this point. I think eventually down the road, Povich will be the better starter. But right now, I'd keep Suarez in there. But I really do expect still the Orioles to add 2 starters. And I'd love for it to be, Corbin Burns and Nathan Eovaldi and let's go get it. Or, I'd love for it to be Garrett Crochet and Sean Manaea. Let's go get it or whatever it may be. And we'll see what that looks like. Love for it to be Nick Pivetta and Max Fried. Like, let's go get it. Yeah, I'm down for that. I don't know which 2 it's going to be, but I think there will be 2. And again, I think then Povich and Suarez both get bumped. Maybe at that point, Povich starts the year back in AAA. Albert Suarez begins the year in the bullpen. And whatever 2 guys you bring in probably slot in somewhere at 1 or 2 and then 3 and 4. So your top 4 is Rodriguez, Eflin, the 2 starters you bring in. And then I think at that point, Dean Kremer is still your number 5 starter heading into the season. And that's kind of the point here. Like if the Orioles were to add 3 starters, then yeah, maybe Kremer could lose his spot. But right now, I think they'll bring in 2. And I think he is above Suarez. And you can let me know again in the comments if you disagree. But I think he's above Suarez and Povich and got, guys a little further down like McDermott, Trevor Rogers, and Brandon Young in the pecking order, and I think he would have that number 5 spot to still hold on to. But it's kind of funny because I feel like at this point, like that is the role for Dean Kremer. Like he's fairly cheap. He's around for 3 more years. He could be a reliever if it came to that. I mean, the Orioles' plan to begin 2022 was for him to pitch out of the bullpen. Then he got hurt, and when he came back 2 months later, the Orioles needed a starter. But that was also coming off a dreadful 2021 season and a 2022 Orioles team that didn't really expect to compete from the beginning of the year. So at this point, going to 2025, trying to win a World Series, you're looking a little bit different, but they at least thought in the past he could be a reliever if they needed him to do it. But I just think like a healthy Dean Kremer is a perfect number 5 starter for a good baseball team. And yeah, did the Orioles want to get probably more for the fire sale of the 2018 deadline? Yes. Is all they have left now that they DFA Dylan Tate left from that Dean Kremer? Like, yeah, it is. And is Dean Kremer basically a number 5 starter? Yeah. But you need those guys on good teams. You need guys who, if he can stay healthy, I think he could push 200 innings. I said it before last year. If he stayed healthy, I think one of my bold predictions is he would pitch 200 innings. Now, he missed 6 weeks, so it became impossible after that for him getting injured. But I think if he can stay healthy, he can push 180, 190, just sitting as the number 4 or 5 guy in this rotation, eating up innings. Now, again, I know we felt okay about it because he was good last September. You don't really want to be in a spot where Dean Kremer is starting a postseason game. If you have to, you have to, and he can give you what he's got, but I'd rather not be in that spot. I'd rather upgrade in the top 4, but you only need 4 postseason starters. If Kramer's your number 5 guy, you roll through at number 5, you put him in the bullpen in the playoffs as your long man, and it's kind of the perfect role. Like everybody needs somebody like Dean Kremer. And I don't want Oriole fans, especially if they do add it and get 1 or 2 like big starting pitching names to add this winter. I don't want you to overlook Dean Kremer, even if he gets bumped to number 5, even if for some reason he gets bumped out of the rotation, which is less likely, but possible. He's been important to this team and he will continue to be important for the next 3 years. Like I don't see Dean Kremer being a guy that the Orioles move on from either, even if they continue to add to the rotation. Like he's a guy they're going to want to have around until he's a free agent, maybe even beyond that, if he can take his game to the next level. But that's the question. Like even with this splitter, that's the big question moving forward. Can he take a step forward? I argued that he really didn't this year. Can he do that next year? Can he hone in the splitter, have the good splitter with the good command all year? And can he refigure out either the sinker or the 4-seamer? He's got to figure out one of his 2 fastballs because he can't have 2 that are mid. One's got to be at least solid. Both were solid in 2023. Neither were this year. At least find a happy medium now that you have that splitter. And maybe he won't shoot above being a number 4 starter, but maybe he's more reliable. Maybe if you needed to use him in the playoffs, you feel a little better. And you'd feel good, hey, at the very least, if you can, for the next 3 years, pencil Dean Kremer in as your number 5 starter to eat innings and pitch most of the year, I think as a rotation trying to win a World Series, you feel really, really good about having Dean Kremer in that spot. But that'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. We've got one more show going on this week that is coming up on Friday, and we've kind of left it open to do some Orioles news and notes. Some names coming out. We maybe get a signing. We maybe get some Orioles rumors. We're going to get to it all on tomorrow's episode. Ken Rosenthal had a report about the Orioles and how they're pursuing pitching. We had a little bit of a nugget about Masson potentially offering some streaming. We'll talk about that and much more on tomorrow's Friday pod. And of course, get you ready for the winter meetings next week. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.